Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Adult and Pediatric Institute podcast. My name is Nicole. This is a podcast where we get messy, we get real, and we talk about real life things. Today, I want to talk about a topic that I feel very intimately involved with, I guess we'll say, and a topic that I really enjoy educating people on, and that is PTSD. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think one of the reasons that I really enjoy talking about this topic is because for about 10 years after I left the military, I was clearly exhibiting symptoms of PTSD, yet there were so many myths in my head associated with PTSD that I didn't really get help for it. And I still had that military mindset of suck it up, buttercup, let's keep on moving forward. And if you say you need help in any way, shape, or form, you're showing a weakness. And I could not have been more wrong. We talk about as we get older, I wish I knew then what I know now. And that is so true in this case, because if I had a better understanding of what PTSD, how it happens, what it does to our body, I would have gotten help for it a whole lot faster after I got out of the military. And so, with all of these taboos surrounding PTSD, a lot of people, especially first responders, military veterans, they choose not to get treatment for it and not to get help for it. And ultimately, that wears away at your body. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about today. So let's kind of dive in by talking about what is PTSD. PTSD is a DSM-5 diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's caused by exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. But it doesn't have to be a direct exposure. It can be indirect. So if you witnessed this act of violence that would meet the criteria. It also is really interesting because PTSD can also occur from prolonged periods of stress. This is important because in the military, for instance, in my case, I was stationed on an aircraft carrier. I was never boots on the ground. I was never shot at. I was never blown up. I never witnessed an IED explosion. I was never in direct combat. Yet, for 3.5 years, I did 3 tours in Operation Iraqi and Enduring Freedom 1 and 2. And that prolonged period of elevated cortisol levels, of elevated stress, of keep your head on a swivel, constantly having to manage and deal with trauma, medical traumas, and things like that, those elevated cortisol levels in my body changed my brain waves and it changed my brain chemistry. And that's what we're finding more and more. And there's more research being done on this is how PTSD is developed from long, prolonged periods of stress. And I find that really interesting. A little back information about how DSM-5 criteria works is there's normally diagnostic criteria chart and you have letters A, B, C, D, so on and so forth. And then under each of those letters, you have numbers that will break down what falls within that category. And so with PTSD, A is exposure to threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence, directly experiencing the traumatic event yourself, witnessing it happening to someone else, learning that the event happened to a close family member or close friend, or experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events. So first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse. These are all things that would fit under criteria A. For B, it's the presence of one or more of the following intrusive symptoms. And so that might be recurrent involuntary distressing memories, dreams, dissociative reactions or flashbacks, and where you feel or you act as if the traumatic event is reoccurring, intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the event, or marked physiological reactions to either internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect. And so What that's looking at is it impacting you in a way that that traumatic event is re-triggering different behaviors and different things. C has to do with avoiding different stimuli associated with the event. So that might be you're avoiding distressing memories, thoughts, feelings about it. You're avoiding external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, things that remind you of the event. D is negative alterations in cognition and mood associated with the traumatic event. What that looks like is it possibly an inability to remember certain aspects of the event, right? You kind of block it out, almost like an amnesia-like effect. And it's one of the ways that your brain is protecting your psyche. Persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about yourself or the world. I'm bad. No one can be trusted. The world's awful. Everything is awful. Persistent, distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the event that lead you to blame yourself or blame others. Negative emotional state, fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame. You might notice you're no longer interested in certain activities that you once were interested in. Sometimes it's a feeling of detachment, or you feel like you're estranged from others, that you're not as close as you once were with other people, or a persistent inability to experience positive emotions, the inability to experience happiness or satisfaction or love. E is marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic event. What that looks like is that irritable behavior, angry outbursts, especially with it not being provoked. It's normally expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects. You're snapping at people, things like that. Reckless or destructive behavior, that might be drinking and driving. That might be using substances, being hypervigilant. With me, this one was a big one with my PTSD symptoms. Every time I was in large crowds, I would become very hypervigilant. It was constantly my head is on a swivel. I need to know where everyone is. I need my back against a wall, things like that. An exaggerated startle response. You scare more easily. Problems with concentration or sleep disturbances. That's another really common one is the sleep disturbances. You have a really hard time turning your brain off, difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, or your sleep feels really restless. A lot of that's tied into the dreams of what was happening. F is the duration of the disturbance. So these symptoms need to last for at least more than 1 month, which is not very long. That's a fairly short period of time, considering a lot of other DSM diagnoses tend to be 6 months, 8 months, things like that. The disturbance also has to cause significant distress or impairment in your life. If you're just dealing with it and it's not causing any distress, it's probably not a mental health disorder that needs diagnosed. But most of the time, by the time you're coming to see someone like us at the Adult and Pediatric Institute, it's because this has been distressing in your life. You've been having issues with this. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of symptoms associated with PTSD. The next thing I want to talk about is a really high level overview of what is happening in your brain when that fight or flight mechanism is triggered. So, we have two major overarching systems, the parasympathetic nervous system and then your sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic is also known as your rest and digest, right? So this is your chill, your resting. It's not your fight or flight. Your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight system. So one of the ways that I remembered that, I remember from nursing school, is I feel really sympathetic to your anxiety. And so it just helps me to remember that it's the sympathetic is your fight or flight. There's a mnemonic that we used, and it was SLUD, and it was salivation, lacrimation, urination, and defecation. So your parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for that SLUD. So when you're calm and you're resting, rest and digest. When you're resting and digesting, you're bowels are working correctly, your mouth isn't dry, your eyes are tearing up appropriately, all of that. You maybe have to go to the bathroom, things like that. When your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, suddenly it doesn't matter if you have to poop when you're running from a bear, right? Your body is shutting down your GI system. It's kind of redirecting those energy cells, glucose, to areas that organs that your body needs to run away from that bear. So it's going to your heart, it's going to your brain, things like that. You end up with a real dry mouth. Well, diving in just a little bit deeper into the sympathetic nervous system, there's two major axes that help mediate the human stress response. One of them is your sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, or your SAM axis, and the other one is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or your HPA axis. So your SAM axis mediates the immediate response to stress. So that's going to flood your body with norepinephrine and epinephrine so that you can run from that bear. Your HPA axis mediates the slower response through corticosteroids, primarily cortisol. And that's where your body starts to release this cortisol for stress so that if you have to run from this bear for a longer period of time. The problem is in today's day and age, uh, we're not really running from a whole lot of bears. Maybe you are, depending on where you live, right? But from an evolutionary standpoint, this was really helpful when we had to run from that saber-toothed tiger or catch our next meal. Nowadays, it's no longer serving as much of a purpose. However, it does serve a purpose. It's a protective factor. It's letting you know that you are sensing some real danger here. And so with PTSD, studies and research are finding that that HPA axis is kind of being turned on, and it is malfunctioning with PTSD. And so it's not turning off. And if you want to look into this more, there's some really great research articles out there on this. It's really quite interesting as to how PTSD is affecting your HPA axis as well as your SAM axis. It's really quite cool. Lastly, I want to talk about some myths associated with PTSD. So, myth number one that I have on my list is that it occurs after a single traumatic event. That's not always the case, especially when we're talking about that prolonged exposure to traumatic things. The example I gave of police officers constantly having to go on calls of domestic violence, or firefighters constantly having to go on calls where they're experiencing other people's trauma and they're having to deal with that. That absolutely can trigger PTSD. Myth number two is PTSD is a weakness. Not true. We are human beings. I think the only weakness comes is from people that are not willing to ask for help. So it is not a sign of weakness at all. It's a sign of your brain and chemistry and your body just reacting to something that's a scary event. Whether you perceive it to be scary or not, your body might perceive it to be scary, right? You're rough and tough, and that's great, but you're still human. So it is not a sign of weakness at all. It's a sign of neurochemistry. Myth number three is that people with PTSD are dangerous. Research indicates that people with PTSD are not inherently more violent than the general population. Some of the symptoms of PTSD are more violent and aggressive outbursts, but a lot of the times that's verbal outbursts. And most of the people that have these outbursts, as long as it's not in a disassociative moment where they don't know what's going on, they're very remorseful. They don't want to scream at their spouse. They don't want to yell at their kids. They don't want to be doing this stuff, and you don't know why they're doing it. And so it can be really scary. And so a lot of people with PTSD will end up isolating because they don't want to hurt the ones that they love. And that's a recipe for disaster, is isolating when you're struggling with something from a mental health perspective. Myth number four that I have on my list is you should avoid triggers. So that's not totally true. So people with PTSD do tend to avoid triggers. I avoid certain triggers. But at the same time, there is a lot of research that shows that some of the treatment for PTSD is not necessarily reliving those triggers, because sometimes that can get a little bit more dangerous, but really processing those triggers, processing the traumatic event where you're in a safe and a controlled environment. Maybe that's a therapist's office, maybe that's a doctor's office, whatever it may be. But reprocessing so that you can sort of change the narrative of, okay, I went through this, but I was safe, right? And reminding yourself constantly, I was safe, I was safe, I was safe, and processing your feelings that you have surrounding those traumatic events. It's a very effective treatment for PTSD. The last myth that I have is that PTSD occurs immediately after a traumatic event. That's not true at all. In fact, symptoms of PTSD can often take months or years to appear. Because a lot of my PTSD was the result of repeated exposures to trauma and prolonged periods of elevated cortisol and stress, it wasn't until I was about a year out of the military that some of my symptoms started to show up. I did have some symptoms when I immediately left. I would have these dreams that there was a medical emergency bell going off, and I would wake up and I was on the floor because I had hit the deck. Or I would wake up and I'm halfway down my stairs to run out the door because I got to get to my battle station. So sometimes some of the symptoms will come right away. But yeah, it could take possibly even years for some of the symptoms to present itself. So, what do you do about this? There's a lot of really, really effective treatment. There's been a ton of research on process. It doesn't work. This is not new. We started looking at this really, really in depth after World War II and Gulf War syndrome and Vietnam. And we really wanted to better understand this and create effective therapies. There are so many effective therapies out there. There is talk therapies like CBT therapy, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. There's EMDR, which is really effective. There's TMS, which is really effective and helps with the depressive symptoms of PTSD. There's exposure therapy. There's medication that you can use to help with these symptoms. So it's really important that if you are experiencing these symptoms, a lot of the times they're not going to go away on your own. And don't wait for your life to kind of crumble around you and your spouse left you and you lost your job and your kids won't talk to you. Don't wait for that to get help. There's no better sign of strength than admitting when you need help for something. That's where the real strength and the real bravery comes into play. And if you can get help for it earlier on, then you can live a happy, healthy life and find that joy again in your life. But the first step is just admitting that you need help and asking for help. Also, if you are struggling with some of these symptoms, you can always call 988. That is a suicide and crisis hotline. So it's not just if you're suicidal, but if you feel like your life is in crisis. They also have the Veterans Crisis Lifeline, same number, 988. You can give them a call. It is 100% free. It is anonymous, and they can really talk you through some of the symptoms that you're feeling in that moment and help you process those feelings so that the feelings can pass, and then help connect you with different resources in your area for help. So don't ever be afraid to ask for help. I hope you guys got something out of this podcast. I hope you learned something. Feel free to drop us a comment, drop us a line to let us know if there's other topics that you'd like us to talk a little bit more about. Thank you so much for listening, and go out and conquer your day.